Dear friends, good evening and thank you for joining us once again this week. As we continue in our travels with Dante and Virgil in these series of lectures that make up this seminar on the spheres of hell, today we're going to cover the spheres of Mars and Jupiter. And in this particular case, where Dante and Virgil continue descending into the realm of hell, let's go back and take a quick peek at what is it that we have already covered. Because as Dante and Virgil come together and they start descending into these infra dimensions of nature, they walk past the vestibule of the indecisive. They cross a river, cross the Acheron, and then they get into the first sphere, which is the sphere of the moon called limbo. This is where we see all those souls that have not expressed, manifested, or practiced a pact of waters, which is known as baptism. Then we see the sphere of Mercury, in which we see the lustful, the sphere of Venus, in which we see the gluttonous, and then we see the sphere of the Sun, where we have the hoarders and the spendthrifters, those who create an imbalance into the cosmic law of the drogo auto-egocrat. So as Dante and Virgil continue with their travels, in the Styx, Dante finds people who are immersed in the mud, and they are sinking one another with their hands, with their feet, with their head. It is a very violent environment, and they strike each other with everything and anything that they have. Virgil tells him that he is looking at the souls that are being destroyed by anger, and that there are even more souls that are lying under the waters of the river Styx, making bubbles with each one of their cries. Virgil tries to repeat the words that they are uttering, but those words cannot be understood. And all the souls that exist there, they are all expressing lamentations and suffering for the soulness of their lives. Because while they are in there, all those shades are in a constant bad temper. They are, as they call, living a depressed moon. And they are lamenting this because in reality, they acknowledge that they should have been living happily under the light of the sun. And as a consequence, because they didn't, now they are in these murky waters and in this very aggressive environment forever. So the poets, they circle the filthy marsh and at last come to a high tower that has no name. The poets, they start approaching the tower when two flames shoot from the top. And immediately, another flame comes from the other side of the marsh of the Styx. And soon after the signal, there is a boatman. Flegias is his name, and he shows up. And Flegias is eager to take more of the damned souls deeper into hell. But when Flegias sees the poets, he becomes very angry. And he starts raging. But as he starts raging, Virgil chastises him, just as he chastised the previous creatures that he met. And the poets are able to enter the boat. As the boat is making way to the other side of the swamp, there is a soul that is rising from the slime and immediately starts threatening Dante. It so happens that that soul, that shade, happened to be Dante's friend. His name was Filippo Argenti, and Filippo was one of the wrathful that was caught in that marsh. Dante and Argenti, they exchange some words, and Dante wishes that Argenti would receive even further punishment. And to these words, as Virgil hears them, he praises Dante for saying them, and he says that Dante will get his wish. And shortly, other shades descend upon Argenti and tear him into bits. At this particular stage, this old friend of Dante, Filippo Argenti, is a very peculiar character in his mastery Dante uses the name Filippo Argenti to explain to us what is happening to that particular soul that is being destroyed in this particular sphere of hell. Because Filippo comes from the Greek root word philo, and that means loving. It means fond of. And Argenti comes from the Proto-Indo-European root word arg, which means the metal mercury. So for all purposes, Filippo Argenti is the one who loves the metal mercury, the one who is fond of the properties, the faculties, the powers of mercury, which is indeed the sacred water of all of the alchemists. So what we see here is that there is a man representing each and every one of us who come into these studies, and that we show sincere love for the particular teaching that we are getting. We allow to manifest through us the longings and the yearnings of the being, and nevertheless, we are still very angry, and we become frustrated with the simplest of things, and because of that, we abuse of the creative power, and thus, the moment that we give free rein to our own anger, then we start bringing into ourselves a lot of suffering. But the story does not end there. As the boat makes its way to the other side of the swamp, and Dante comes across Filippo Argenti, and Dante states that he should be punished even further, and Filippo is dragged down deeper into the marsh and torn apart. The boat continues its march, and it approaches the other shore. It is there that Dante sees the city of Dis, where the fires of hell are glowing intensely. As Dante and Virgil are drifting away from this particular sphere of Mars, friends, the sphere of Mars is the one that is responsible for the destruction of all of our psychological aggregates of wrath, anger, hatred, resentment, and vengeance. So all of those aspects of hatred that for us it is so easy to see in everyone else, then we have to start making an effort to notice how is it that hatred in ourselves exists as well. But maybe not as aggressive as in other people who decide to just take arms and go and inflict some serious destruction and death into others. But we have to then look at ourselves in all those instances where our hatred expresses itself in very subtle ways, where we are just trying to speak very calmly, perhaps trying to show some very calm and composed demeanor, but in the meantime, the words that we are saying are destined to bring suffering to all of the others. And hatred, of course, comes in many different versions and many different flavors. And we can see hatred against race, and we can see hatred expressed because of sexual preferences. We can see hatred because of politics. We can see all these things. And maybe you do not experience those. Maybe you can say that, yeah, you are very tolerant of everybody's preferences and that you respect everyone's opinions. But we have to look even further, because sometimes we express our hatred only by seeing the way that other people dress. If we see somebody who is wearing a hat and it's a baseball hat and it's crooked or it's tilted backwards or is worn in a way that is different than we would wear it, we tend to show or manifest some disgust. Sometimes we express our hatred by hearing music, and we will listen to some music that we dislike, and rather than allow it to flow through the mind without the mind creating any type of resistance, we speak ill of the people who listen to the music, and we extrapolate their judgment and their abilities and their qualities based on our perception of the quality of the music that they listen. So the key message here is that we are not exempt from hatred. The fact that it exists all around us is an indication that it exists within us. Because remember, the exterior is a reflection of the interior. And here in this particular fifth sphere, the sphere of Mars, we also see the vengeful. And we see this dynamic very clearly on all those shades that are dragging themselves and constantly striking and hitting each other with their hands and their feet and even with their heads. Not only we see the expression of hatred as that strong dislike that all of them have for each other, we also see the images of the vengeful as they hurt themselves very aggressively, as they yell and they scream at each other. Because at the end of the day, that is us as well. Maybe we don't go through life expressing our desire for vengeance and showing and telling people the things that we're planning to do to them. But the thing is that sometimes all it takes is for somebody to steal the parking spot that we wanted to take. Sometimes all it takes is just a stoplight to go from green to red and just delay our arrival to our meeting by maybe 30 seconds or just 1 minute. And something as simple as that then becomes in our own conditioning reasoning enough for us to get angry and vengeful. And the moment that somebody says something that we do not like, then what we would like to do is just react aggressively against that. But here, in this particular sphere, not only we have the vengeful and the wrathful, we also have the blasphemous. And this is us as well. Because when we consider that we go through the pre-chamber and we learn about something as mantras, who are words of power, one of those topics that most of the people who come into the pre-chamber studies come looking for, because they will like mantras that will bring them inner peace, or words of power that would help them bring their chakras to vibrate in harmony and allow for the development of their internal faculties and powers. Everybody wants mantras. Others want some mantras for protection, to defend themselves from the forces of darkness or to make themselves invisible, etc., etc. And what we learn from the Buddhist teachings is that not only mantras are words of power, we learned that because they are words of power, mantras are something that we can create even in our own language. We do not have to learn the words in Sanskrit. We don't have to learn the words in some very ancient language to make them powerful and meaningful. We can use our own beautiful language for so. Because we know that in the power of the word we can bring soothing to the afflicted heart, or we can bring destruction. And we can bring a lot of suffering into somebody who is having a good day. So whenever we are using the power of the word in ways that are destructive, we're being blasphemous. Every time that we are stealing of our creative energy for the sake of speaking in lewd context and express our sarcasm and make fun of others and bash and damage the name of the creative force and abuse of the power that is granted to us, which is a power that comes to us from the Holy Spirit, we are effectively being blasphemous. And you can imagine then that all of those souls that are there within the marsh of the Styx, that they are not saying encouraging things to each other. They're certainly expressing all of their vengeance and all of their hatred, not only by screaming things at each other and hitting each other, but also by forcing even other souls to remain deep within the filth of the Styx itself. And even here, in this particular sphere, we see those psychological aggregates of arrogance, those that make us very cruel against everyone else, because we tend to believe that we are so great and that we are so deserving and that others should not. And all it takes is perhaps a little bit of observation in our daily transactions. And after a few days, we start seeing our arrogant tendencies. And we see them because we may have this or that credit card, or because we may dress in this way or that way when compared to others. We see them because we may have a role in our organization that is perhaps organizationally a little higher than the role of someone else. And when we walk past them, well, we look down on them. And maybe this is not your case. Maybe you say, no, I think that everybody's the same. But we have to be even a little bit more observant and watchful than that. Because many instances, when a homeless person who has been living in very difficult conditions and circumstances, where they have been going for days without knowing from where their next meal is going to come from, when they are suffering because they are losing hope, and as they approach us, asking, maybe for something to eat, even before they say anything, we look at them with disgust. And in there is no compassion. There is no kindness in our reaction. Those are different aspects of our own arrogance. Friends, this is what we see in the sphere of Mars. This is the sphere of the wrathful. And here in this sphere, Samael tells us that the mental imagery that is created by all of these souls is so aggressive, and they are so terrified that in those forests that they tend to create, they see themselves hiding from each other. And what we see here is the very same consciousness confronting its very own creations. Friends, what we see here is a consciousness that is facing eye to eye all of those creations that it never brought into an end, and particularly the violent ones. So on one side, there are aspects of that consciousness that is terrified and that is hiding behind the trees, behind any other kind of mental formation creation, behind the rocks. And there are other aspects of the same consciousness itself that is actively hunting it and looking for it to destroy it and bring pain and suffering. This is the type of dynamic that is seen in this particular sphere. And this is why the Apostle Mark quotes the words of the great Master Jesus when he says, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." For those of us who read this very literally and superficial, we will see these words and we will see them as inspiring words, and they may generate a sensation of satisfaction within. But we have to go past that shallowness, and we have to go deep into the context that the great Master is leaving there for us to grasp. Because when he is saying that you shall love the Lord your God, he is speaking about the innermost. He is speaking about El, and El is our Father who is in secret. El is our own spirit, and El is also our real being, our Glorian, the Father of our Father, that manifestation of God that is known as I am that I am. So we need to learn to love the Lord, our innermost, our internal God. But we need to learn to love it with all of our heart. And that means that it has to be not only with compassion, not only with kindness, not only with the superior emotions that are manifest from the being itself. It means that we have to love our innermost with all of the wisdom that we get from Gnosis, because Gnosis is a doctrine of the heart. It is that thing that we get out of every possible abstraction with our own interactions with others. It is the discovery of ourselves that exists behind every corner, every time that we are observing and looking at how is it that we react internally before the temptations and the circumstances of life. The great master also says, you have to love the Lord, your innermost, with all of your soul. And this soul, this is our consciousness, that today is deeply fragmented. So that means that for us to be able to have that consciousness being functional, loving our innermost, we have to rescue that consciousness from each one of those cages that it is trapped today. So as we work on the elimination of that psychological aggregates, as our Divine Mother helps us liberate that consciousness comes back together into itself. And as it awakens, as it becomes stronger and more powerful, it can then recreate that direct linkage, that connection to the innermost itself. The great master says you have to love the Lord, your innermost, with all of your mind. But it is not the mind of the ego. It is the quiet mind. It is the mind that we have learned to make serene so that it can then receive the word of the innermost itself. And you would remember that that mind is indeed the interior mind. It is the one capable of receiving the deep wisdom that exists within all of the great cosmic truths. So we have to awaken the interior mind, and with that mind is that we truly love our innermost, because then we can hear it. Then we can grasp what it is actually telling us. And then the great Master Jesus tells us, you have to love the Lord, your innermost, with all of your strength. But this is not the muscular strength. This is not the strength of the legs or the lower back. This is not the strength that we find in our abdominals. This is the strength of our creative power. So that means that we need to learn to make use of our creative power so that we can use it and put it at the service of the innermost. We have to embrace the true chemical chastity so that all of this nourishment that we get out of our creative waters, nourishment that feeds the physical, the ethereal, the astral, the mental, the causal bodies, the body of the soul, the body of the innermost, so that all of this becomes available, and that those superior garments of the soul, the wedding garment of the being, that it can then be created. And he closes by saying, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he says this because he is not implying love the person that lives across the street the same way that you love yourself, meaning the reflection that you're seeing in the mirror in the morning. It is not that. At this moment, the great Master Jesus is not speaking to the personalities. He is not speaking to those physical bodies. He is speaking directly to the consciousness. And this is why it tells you need to love your neighbor as yourself. Because our neighbor is also a consciousness. It is fragmented, just as our is. Maybe it's even less fragmented. We do not know. But our neighbor is also a consciousness. Our neighbor also has an innermost. So we have to learn to love our neighbor just as we love ourselves. We have to look at each other from a perspective of a consciousness to another that are struggling, that are suffering, that we all have in common, just a common cause. And it is to be able to find happiness, to be able to shed and destroy this inhumanity that we're carrying within, so that we can at least live in love, in liberty, and in peace. Because this innermost that we have within is a great warrior. And in the great Hindi writings, in those sacred scriptures of the Mahabharata is the great warrior itself. And we see him personified in the figure of Arjuna. And Arjuna is always standing in this golden chariot that is pulled by those 4 white horses. The golden chariot are the superior existential bodies of the being. The four white horses, those are the four superior bodies: physical, astral, mental, and causal. And we see that this great warrior is together with Krishna, the representation of the Christ. In the story of the great warrior, Arjun presents himself into a battlefield, and as he is standing there in his chariot with his four horses, he contemplates his enemy. And as he looks at the thousands of people who were there, as he is getting ready to fight them, he realizes that they are all his own family. They have the faces of the people he loves. And he hesitates, and he says, wait, I cannot fight them. They are my family. But the Christ in him, in that spirit of the Savior that saves us, he clarifies the situation, and he explains why is it that he has to go and fight them. And in the teaching that we have there, it's of course not for us to go out and fight our families to the death, because that would be ludicrous. The teaching is superior in nature. And what he is showing us is that we need to learn to confront and fight those things that we love the most about our own selves. Because we think that we are great. And we think that everybody should love us. We think that everybody should admire us. That we should get recognition every so often. We tend to believe that we are good enough, that we deserve to be forgiven every time that we make mistakes. And that we should be given opportunities. And whenever somebody outside goes against any one of those false descriptions that we have created about ourselves, then we rebel. It is our psychological aggregates what make us create this false sense of being. Our psychological aggregates are the thing that deceive us time and time again into creating these great models of what we are, when in reality, we are cruel, and we are abusive, and we deceive, and we sometimes try to play the system, everything in our favor, so that things become perhaps more favorable for us than for anybody else. So we speak of the innermost, and we speak of the innermost as a great warrior, because what the innermost is doing here with us and now is working our consciousness so that we can effectively observe and fight these psychological aggregates that we have consciously while we are out here walking under the face of the sun. We have the option of working here with our Divine Mother and observing, comprehending, and eliminating our defects. Working to transmute our creative energies so that we can awaken the sacred fire of our own Kundalini. And if we don't do it here, under the guidance of the innermost, that is a great warrior, moving us into this internal battle with our own selves, then it would be the catabolic forces of nature, or that fifth manifestation of our Divine Mother, what will take care of destroying all of these psychological aggregates in the fifth sphere of hell. So again, it is in this particular sphere that the consciousness faces itself, and terrified, it tries to run and hide, while other aspects of the consciousness itself are actively seeking it, actively hunting it, with the intent of bringing damage and bringing suffering. And if that is a way in which we need to be able to become conscious on how damaging our own inhumanity is, then we can certainly imagine that it would be quite terrifying. Friends, in this particular sphere of Mars, this is a sphere that is governed by 488 laws. That is 10 times as many laws as we have here. And if here we feel ourselves sometimes bound because we don't have true liberty of motion and we don't have true liberty of expression, here in this particular realm, that for us to be able to go from one country to another, we need paperwork and we need permissions and we need somebody to say that it is okay and we have to comply with. So if we think that this is sometimes too much, then imagine that 10 times worse. If it is terrifying for us to walk into that upper sphere, that lower sphere of the moon, and experience the 96 laws in one of our nightmares where we feel that we cannot move our hands and our legs and that we cannot scream, then certainly, if that happens at 96, we can imagine that at 488, it would still be a little bit more uncomfortable, and that there would be, of course, a lot of more suffering. So what happens? As Dante and Virgil go through this particular spectacle, the boat continues its travels, and it approaches the other shore. It is there where Dante sees the city of Dis, where the fires of hell are glowing. Virgil tells Dante that an angel from heaven is going to descend to open the gates. And as they're approaching Flechias, he lets the poets off the boat. As they get there, they are immediately accosted by the group of shades that question Dante's appearance in the realm. And the shades, at first, they refuse Dante to pass, though they say that Virgil can enter, but not to return in his own circle. Dante by then is very afraid, and he is afraid that he will never be allowed to leave hell. And he cries to Virgil to have him come and remedy the situation. So Virgil goes alone to the gate of the city of Dis to see if he can open it. And he returns unsuccessful in his task. But he assures Dante that a great one is on his way to open the gates. Virgil listens then intently for the arrival of the angel, because there is so much dark mist that he is unable to see. And he regrets that he and Dante cannot enter the gates by themselves. But they were promised help. And even though it seems that it's long delayed, they remain there patient. Dante, he becomes alarmed and he asks Virgil, his guide. And he asks, in kind of a roundabout way, if anyone from the upper circles has made ever this particular descent. And Virgil answers that he was once sent to summon a shade from the circle of Judas, far below there, so he knows the way very well. As they are having this conversation, there are three furies that spring into view. And they are saying that they should summon Medusa to turn Dante into stone. And Virgil cautions Dante to hide his eyes against the beast. And then Virgil covers Dante's eyes. As that happens, a noise like a hurricane causes the poets to look towards the marsh of the Styx. And they see a figure that is crossing without touching the marsh. The spirits, they run away from him, and he moves his left hand before him to dispel the fog of the marsh itself. Dante recognizes this heavenly messenger, and Virgil asks him to remain quiet and to bow down. The infuriated messenger reaches the gate, and the gate opens at the touch of his wand. And he then reproves the insolent angels for trying to stop what is willed in heaven. Now, this particular angel that is coming to open the gates of the city of Dis, even though it is expressed that he is infuriated, he is not angry. There is no room in an enlightened creature for anger, just like there is no room for vengeance and there is no room for arrogance or any of the other defects that we carry. If anything, we can speak that this is an internal fury, that this is a righteous indignation. It is a particular emotion that we can only translate as anger. Nevertheless, again we say that those enlightened beings, they do not have anger within their own selves. So the poets enter the gate into the sixth circle. By the time that they cross that gate of the city of this, they get then to an area where they have to cross a river, and the river is the Flageton. In this sixth circle, this is where Dante and Virgil walk into the sphere of the heretics. So what happens here? The poets enter the gate into the sixth circle, and Dante then becomes eager to learn about the inhabitants of this city. Dante, he sees a countryside of sorrow and a huge graveyard with uneven tombs covering the plain. The tombs are raised to a red heat by flames outside of every wall. And there are moanings and sounds of torment that are coming from within the open tombs. Dante seeks Virgil, and he asks, what sinners are residing in these tombs? And Virgil answers that they are the arch-heretics of all the cults and all of their followers. So what we have in this sixth sphere are the heretics. And dear friends, all these heretics, these are the materialist atheists that have become enemies of the Eternal One. Here we see hardcore materialists, those who believe that we are just a product of some random chemical reaction that happened under the most improbable causes and conditions. These are those who are convinced that we are emerging out of a primordial soup, that there is nothing after this life, that consciousness is nothing more than a series of chemical reactions that take place in the brain itself, that considerations, ideas, and concepts are only side effects of different concentrations of substances that we carry within our body, rather than seeing the possibility of those concentrations and those chemical reactions being themselves a side effect of the consciousness itself. It is here where we see all of these enemies of the Eternal One as those who are abusive against children, abusive against those who are in lesser conditions. These are all those who abuse of their powers. These are those who manipulate the systems, those who are false forgers of metals, the ones who will betray everyone. And here, in this particular sphere of Jupiter, what we see is that those 480 laws that govern the sphere of Mars increase by an additional 96. And thus, here we have 576 laws. This adds up to the number 21. And that 21 reminds us of the fool of the tarot. But if we look at that 21 and we Kabbalistically bring it together, it adds up to a number 3. That under constructive and positive circumstances, it speaks to beauty and aesthetics. And here, what we see is all those souls of people who treated their relationships and their dynamics with themselves, with their spouse, with their community, with their state, with their nation, with their innermost, with the universe, with the utmost of disrespect. This is right here the sphere of the heretics. This invites us to consider for a second that when we speak of Jupiter, We are speaking of Jupiter as the father of all of the gods. When we see Jupiter, Jupiter is in reality a combination of names. We have Io and we have Pitar. Iopitar is Jupiter. And in Io, we see the combination of the eye, which is a phallic symbol, and we see the circle as a feminine receptive symbol. So for all purposes, in the number 10, we have the lingam and the yoni, that together they form a cross. Here we see andros and genikas. We see the divine androgen, andros genikas. And in Pitar, Pitar is associated to the fathers, to the parents. So Jupiter is the father of all of those divine androgens or gods. And we also find the very same concept of andros genikas in the name of Joseph, the one who is mentioned to be Mary's husband when Mary was pregnant and she went into exile to be able to just give birth to Jesus. His name was Josephus, Io plus Cephas. Io, we know that it's already that masculine and feminine force together, and Cephas means stone. So here we see the work with the philosopher's stone. We see in the symbol of Joseph, that father of Jesus here on earth, that there is a masculine and feminine balance, and that there is a work with the philosopher's stone. We also see the very same androgenikas in the name of our Divine Mother, Ram Io, Mary, or Diana, or Cybele, any way we want to refer to her, but in this particular name, Ram Io. And we see as well the forces of the masculine and the feminine in the name of the unmentionable. In the name of Jehovah, or Jorjava, we see the Yod as a masculine symbol, and we see the He as a feminine symbol. So Yod He, Vav He speaks of the union of the work that has to be done between a man and a woman. All those who betray this work, all those who abuse of each other, end up in this particular sphere of hell. So as we stated, the poets enter the gate into the sixth circle, and Dante is eager to learn about the inhabitants of the city. He sees a countryside of sorrow and a huge graveyard with uneven tombs covering the plain. The tombs are raised, and they are raised to a red heat by flames outside of every wall, and moaning and sounds of torment come from within the open tombs. And Dante would ask Virgil, what sinners reside in these tombs? And Virgil will answer that they are the arch-heretics of all the cults and all of their followers. So dear friends, as we bring this into a close, because we're speaking here of defects like blasphemy and attacks against the creative powers, we would like to leave you with the words of the Apostle Matthew when he quotes the great Master Jesus by saying, "Wherefore I say unto you, all manner of sin and blasphemy shall be forgiven unto men, but the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, that shall not be forgiven unto men. And whosoever speaks a word against the Son of Man, he shall be forgiven. But whosoever speaks against the Holy Spirit, it shall not be forgiven, not in this world, and not in the world to come." So let's remember that the use of our word, of our creative power, against the forces of creation against the beauty of creation is a sin considered against the Holy Spirit. And those are sins that are not meant to be forgiven. It is possible that our Divine Mother, in her infinite love and kindness, that she may decide to go through more sacrifices for us, her ungrateful children, and that she may negotiate something for us. But let's not bet on that. It is way better for us to maintain the right level of observation, so that before we say those things that we would regret later, that we don't say them. That before we commit those acts that we could regret later, that we don't give ourselves to them, and that we don't make them. So, dear friends, this has been our lecture on the spheres of Mars and Jupiter. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and may all beings be happy.